welcome everybody. We're going to do Job 3 today. So you guys want to turn open there. Job 3 launches right into a poem, right? Although we have one bit of narrative at the very beginning, and it's really contingent on what comes before because it begins with after this. So it points us back to what came before. The scene right before it is when Job and his three friends, Zophar, Bildad, and Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar, in the proper order, they have come to be with Job. They're mourning with him. They've joined him in all of the mourning rituals, tearing their robes, putting dirt on their heads, and sitting silently for 7 days with him. And if we looked at some other texts about grieving in the Bible, 7 days is the ritual time of mourning. You see this, like, for example, when David, this is a little bit unusual, but when David grieves for his son, it's actually before he dies, but it goes on for 7 days. They mourn Saul for 7 days. So this is like a typical ritual time. Upon which the end of that time, the expectation would be that the mourning would end, and then you would try to resume kind of a restored life. Of course, that doesn't happen in Job. If it did, there wouldn't be a story of the book of Job. Also important for chapter 3 is what we've seen already Job speak. So in the question of the book is in chapter 1, verse 9, where the Satan character, and we could talk more about that, but let me just say the Satan character, the accuser, asks a question, right? Asks God, does Job fear you for no reason, for no benefits? In other words, if you took every benefit that you're giving him away, would he still be loyal to you? And this is what starts the ball rolling. There's a prediction made by this accuser character that Job would curse God to his face. So you have this issue of like, will Job curse God, right? And that's going to be the lingering question. We have a couple of quick answers to that in the narrative. No. He blesses God, like the opposite of cursing God. And he has these kind of blanket statements of faith. God is given, God can take away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Naked I came into the world, naked I'll be leaving this world. He credits God with both the good and the bad. There's something to talk about there. Do we credit God with the bad in our lives? But all of this sets up chapter 3. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Well, you said the accuser. Is there any scholarly debate on if this accuser is or is not Satan at all, or is that just how you refer to him as?
Right. So if we were going to pin down on chapter 2, we definitely want to talk about that. And quickly, in Job 2 and in Job 1, this character has the definite article before the Satan. So it's really a title more than a name. Okay. And that changes the nature of maybe the way we should. And he's also somebody who works for God. He's one of the divine beings coming into this kind of courtroom, or his job is to go around the earth and find people who are guilty in some way and to bring them up before God. Of course, he doesn't bring Job up, God does. It's like, hey, have you considered my servant Job? We know that there's nobody like him, blameless and upright, turning away from evil. He is, according to the narrator, according to God, the best out there. But there's a progression in the introduction to Satan. In Job, it's not the Satan of the New Testament. It's maybe an early sort of form of that accusation. Okay, any other questions before we get into the poetry? My point here with the narrative is that after 7 days, Job decides to speak, but it's not a restored speech, as we'll see. In fact, he presses into a curse instead of a blessing. So one of the open questions that we could talk about is the Job of Job 3 the same Job of Job 1 and 2? Because he sounds a lot different than the confession that preceded the 7 days of mourning.
Dr. Hawley?
Yeah, Matt?
When you were discussing the 7-day period, how does that interact with the Sabbath at all? Is there any sort of special things they would do different if that 7 days, obviously at some point it would interact with it, but would it just be what they were still doing in their period of mourning?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that the particular Sabbath day comes up in texts that talk about the 7-day period. I mean, it's a week. That's 7 is this kind of schematic or typological number throughout the Bible. So maybe that's why that period of time is chosen. But we don't know anything, as far as I know from biblical texts, about how the actual Sabbath day would have functioned within that 7-day period. Job is waiting to... I think Job expects to die, and as we'll see, that's what he wants. His first question is not, "Oh God, why is this happening to me? Why have you made me suffer this way?" That's a question that we think Job asks right away and throughout, but really what he wants is just to die. Like for the first few speeches, well, before we get into chapter 3, like if we looked at chapter 6, verse 8, so Job 6:8. He tells us what his request is. He says, "Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant my desire." And this is what he wants more than anything, that God would be pleased to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. So all he wants is to die. And I think that's important for recognizing Job 3 as an authentic, this is, I wish I was never born. This is an authentic expression of grief and lament, but it's more than lament. It's a curse. Will Job curse God? Well, this doesn't exactly say that Job curses God, but he does curse a whole day of the calendar, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're getting into as we're nearing our discussion of Leviathan. And let me see if you all have any other questions or comments.
I had one.
Joseph?
Do you think the reason he wants that is because he doesn't have anything left to live for, or because he wants his torment that he's going through to end?
I think both. Yeah, everything has been destroyed in his life, all of his household, of course, then his 7 sons and 3 daughters. And Job has abundant wealth. Maybe important to understand what kind of story this is. This is kind of a schematic wisdom tale where everything is the most perfect you could possibly imagine, and then everything gets as terrible as you can possibly imagine, which sets up the issue that the book is dealing with of innocent suffering and the justice of God and these types of things. There's no way out of that. This is something that's unfair that's happened to him. But from Job's perspective, he doesn't know about that discussion that God has had with Hasatan, he doesn't know why he's suffering. He doesn't know that it's because he's so righteous. Instead, like we are, when suffering happens, he's in the dark. He doesn't really say why this is happening or why he's hurting so bad. He just wants to end. Mm-hmm. And maybe expects it to end. Why would all of this terrible stuff happen to him in his life and not him himself not be put to death? So it's kind of all of the above for him. He doesn't just start speaking a curse, but he begins with this eloquent poem. And everything from 3 on to into chapter 42 is poetry, almost everything, with short narrative. Job said this, Eliphaz says this, the narrator will barely break in. And you should know that the book of Job is like the most difficult Hebrew in all of the Bible. It's highbrow literature. It's about a very real human experience in the sense of innocent suffering or righteous people suffering is something that we all experience, whether it's us or people around us. However, the literature itself is really complicated. So he begins with the curse, and really in chapter 3, 1 through 10 is the curse proper. And then 11, we get the question why, and that's the lament question. And he asks it again in verse 20, why? So the last part of the chapter is lament, but what we're focusing on is just the first 10 verses here. He begins with, "Let the day perish in which I was born." So verse 3. "And the night that said," so there's like this personification of the night. A boy or a man-child, this is confusing. He uses an odd word to describe himself. It's for a baby being conceived. So the core of his curse is that the day that he was born on be removed from the calendar. It's a more extreme way of saying, I wish I was never born, because it's not just about him. It's about the whole day. And what we'll see in this curse is kind of retrospectively trying to undo creation. In fact, the key verse here is verse 4, let that day be darkness. That same phrase, and it's a simple phrase, is an echo, it seems to be even an allusion to Genesis 1:3, the first command that God gives in the day of creation, let there be light. And here, Job is saying, let there be darkness, and let that day not have light. So it's like he's undoing the very fabric of God's creation. We see later on that he's trying to do away with a year. On day 4 of Genesis 1, you might recall that God creates a calendar, puts seasons and stars and the lights that fills that light space with all of these things. And Job is trying to get rid of any possible light. So even if there was a night, let that night be barren, right? So he's
don't fill it.
Yeah. Don't fill it up. He wants it to be non-existent so that he was not existent. So it's more extreme than just saying, I wish I wasn't born. He's sort of trying to undo something bigger, right?
So like, God said it was good, and he's saying this is bad.
Yeah, right.
So bad.
Yeah, and that kind of criticism of divine order is what spurs on the whole dialogue. Not to get into the dialogue, but if you want to know why Job's friends open their mouths, it's not to explain his suffering. I think it's to respond to this. And even when God speaks in chapter 38, the first thing he asks, who is this who darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Right? So he's pushing back on Job in chapter 3. If we were going to talk about what God has to say, then does God have a problem with Job, what Job is saying here? And I would say yes and no. That's open. But Michael Fishbane, biblical scholar, I will describe who he is, but I love this phrase where he calls Job 3, he goes through 13, nothing less than a counter-cosmic incantation. And I think, just to make this really practical, people who are suffering in extreme ways, the whole world is dark. It's not just me and my situation is bad, but you kind of just want all of creation to suffer with you and to be darkened. And Job is kind of extending his own suffering to the whole cosmos, and even not just saying, I wish, but cursing the day. We don't use incantations too much, I suppose, but this is pretty normal for his world. Just like a blessing has efficacy, it gets things done, so can a curse. It can get things done. And so it's really powerful, dark language that Job is using. Leviathan is in the middle of this, so we're nearing him, or it. You have verse 7, yes, let that night be barren, let no joyful cry be heard in it. If we read the rest of 3, by the way, he sort of moves away from, I wish this day never existed, to, even if I was born, I wish I was still born. And we could, by the way, compare this to Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 20, Jeremiah says things just like this. And maybe this text even seems to be borrowing from Jeremiah. There's another text in Jeremiah 4 where there's kind of this counter-cosmic incantation. So there's a lot to unpack here.